Thank you very much. And welcome to Cats and Dogs here on Press TV with me, Len Potopic, where we take a trip across the Atlantic to consider ethnic cleansing Canadian style. Now, this is the 43rd episode of Cats and Dogs. Yes, and I am counting because I've been promised a party when we get to episode 5,000. And you're all invited, so make a note to be free for a big night out in about 100 years. By contrast, there's no party as Canada looks back over the last 100 years as they lose count of unmarked graves connected with residential schools. Viewers in Canada, beware. You might be living on top of yet another unmarked graveyard where boarding school students are buried. Yes, during the 19th and 20th century, more than 130 compulsory boarding schools were funded by the Canadian government and run by religious authorities. However, news of huge numbers of graves of children at residential schools, which first grabbed their headlines, seems to have become repetitive for media outlets. In another classic example of how the media works, they've decided it's just become a bit boring, especially in the West. Yes, they prefer to leave aside all this awkward talk about the massacre of an Indigenous population in Canada over the past 100 years or so and focus on, for example, the death of Biden's dog instead. Experts still don't seem able to explain the true goal these schools were pursuing. But the actual result was quite clear, separating Indigenous children from their families, exposing many to starvation, sexual abuse, disease, and death. Canada tends to present itself as a sort of paradise for migrants. Blue skies, green forests, snow-capped mountains, fast-flowing rivers. And Canada's government likes to be seen as politically angelic. So these scandalous revelations don't really fit the image. It's like discovering that the person you always thought was Mother Teresa was in fact Darth Vader in disguise. It's all part of an old rule in the Wild West, which we can call the conservation of brutality. Brutality in the West never disappears, it just shifts form. Now, normally, Canada seems totally opposed to the killing of innocent people. For instance, they objected wildly when the Saudis violently killed Jamal Khashoggi, which was not just messy, but also became very public. And that was bad, because all the publicity upset people, and that bothers Ottawa a lot. If you're going to kill people illegally, you've got to do it quietly. The problem is, it's all gone a bit public in Canada too. Studies show systemic discrimination against Native people in Canada may lead victims to alcoholism and suicide, or trouble with the police. In a strange twist to Canada's celebration of personal freedoms, they've given the Native population the freedom to choose between death by boarding school, ethnic discrimination, suicide, or potentially police brutality. Some say gold prospectors are coming across new unmarked graves instead of gold deposits as ground-penetrating radar locates further bodies of native students. Canada is indeed a land of odd opportunities. Buy a radar, go prospecting and find ghosts instead of gold. Amidst the scandal, flags are being lowered to half-mast. But if it carries on like this, with new unmarked graves emerging all the time, the flags could have to be lowered to no mast at all by the end of the year. Canadian Premier Justin Trudeau now seems too shocked to make an apology on behalf of the Canadian government. So he's done what any responsible national leader would do. He's blamed the Pope. Yes, Trudeau has called on Pope Francis to apologise for the Catholic Church's role in what's been called cultural genocide. Now, if the Canadian Prime Minister gets any more shocked, he'll have to take the only remaining step available to him. And that's also blame China, Iran and Russia too. Pope Francis is now expected to come to Canada later this year to talk and perhaps say sorry for the deaths of these Indigenous children. If Trudeau is really smart, he might be able to get the Pope to also apologise for the deaths of Yemeni children who were killed with Canadian-made arms and bombs sold to the Saudis and Emiratis. I mean, how was Trudeau supposed to know Canadian-made weapons would be used to actually kill people? Returning back to the main and safer news, Trudeau has sent Joe Biden a bunch of Montreal smoked meat sandwiches after losing a bet on the outcome of this year's Stanley Cup hockey competition. And thus we come full circle, as order is restored by the Western media as they focus on the stories that really matter. Hockey and smoked sandwiches, showing that they really do know how to swallow hard over Indigenous food.
Te dujitu. Za dikshku gidugishku lies. Isakovich Dahovich.
Dawa dirita utakushkishki.
Tetada. Tetama da gokskitig. Skiwi hikaloga hikashukstal. Kokakahat. Tetakatak. Kochiskate chisadatatat.
Ogata hui. Tani sikwa sikondano.
Osh pur. A guy shol. Ushu. Udapu. No, go work cut. They do tadu da wishu. He did. Kahoda. What they cut the hawks, the Atonaxi, but used to.
Incidentally, Canadian police have been investigating after 2 century-old Catholic churches were burned to the ground within hours of one another on Indigenous lands in British Columbia. Now, there are a number of obvious suspects here. Top of the list, of course, are Indigenous families, but closely followed by China, Russia, and, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. In the spirit of fair play, though, here on Cats and Dogs, ladies and gentlemen, I can now reveal we have a live video call with the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, thanks for joining us here on Cats and Dogs. All winter and spring, you discovered new unmarked graves of Indigenous students. Are you going to apologise or just hang on?
We're definitely in line for a much better summer, but we still have to hang on.
OK, so you're hanging on so you can just share the blame with the Pope when he arrives.
We understand that we don't get through this unless we all get through this together.
And why send sandwiches to Biden amidst all this tragedy? Isn't that a bit insensitive?
I think even amidst all the tragedy, really hopeful for the kind of world that we're going to, come into through this dark time.
A world of sandwiches and hockey. Thank you, Prime Minister Trudeau. That's all for this week on Cats and Dogs. Join me again to find out who's bearing bad news, who's putting smoked sandwiches above Indigenous deaths, and who's trying to blame it all on the Pope. That's all on Press TV with me, Len Potopic, and Cats and Dogs.